The airplane came apart in the air. Pieces fell for 2 minutes. That line comes from a North Vietnamese ground controller's after-action report filed on August 12, 1972. He watched the radar return of a MiG-21 break into 3 separate contacts somewhere northeast of Hanoi, each one descending at a different rate. The pilot's name appears in Vietnamese records as Nguyen Van Coc. He had 600 hours in the MiG-21, which made him one of the more experienced men in the Vietnamese People's Air Force. He turned into the merge against a pair of F-4 Phantoms from the 555th Tactical Fighter Squadron. The engagement lasted 11 seconds from first radar contact to impact. Nguyen Van Coc attempted a head-on pass. The F-4 carried an AIM-7 Sparrow radar-guided missile with a warhead weighing 66 pounds. At closing speeds exceeding 1,200 knots, combined velocity of both aircraft rushing toward each other, the geometry of a head-on intercept gave the MiG pilot almost no time to react. The Sparrow left the Phantom's fuselage rail and tracked the MiG's radar return. It detonated close enough to shred the forward fuselage. Nguyen Van Coc never transmitted again. If you had family who flew Phantoms over Vietnam, or served alongside those who did, hit subscribe and leave their story in the comments. Like the video so others can find it. These men deserve the record. The wreckage scattered across 4 kilometers of rice paddies south of Kep Airfield. Local militia recovered the engine largely intact. The cockpit section landed separately. Vietnamese records note recovery of the pilot's remains but provide no further detail. What matters here is the geometry. The F-4 Phantom carried its Sparrow missiles in recessed wells beneath the fuselage, fed targeting data by the AN/APQ-120 pulse Doppler radar mounted in that enormous nose. The radar's scan volume covered a 60-degree cone forward. Inside that cone, at ranges between 5 and 25 nautical miles, anything coming toward the Phantom entered a killing field that grew more lethal the faster the target approached. Head-on closure worked against the attacker. Every knot of the MiG's own airspeed shortened the reaction window and compressed the timeline, feeding energy into the collision equation. The Sparrow didn't need to be perfect. It needed to be close. A proximity fuse and 66 pounds of continuous rod warhead handled the rest. Soviet advisors in Hanoi understood this before most Vietnamese pilots learned it the hard way. Internal briefing documents from the Soviet Military Advisory Group, declassified in 1993, used a specific phrase to describe the Phantom's forward hemisphere. The translated term reads, "Zone of assured destruction." Their word, not mine. So, why did pilots keep flying into it? The missile measured 12 feet long and weighed just over 500 pounds. It rode in a semi-recessed well under the Phantom's belly, partially tucked into the airframe to reduce drag. 4 triangular fins at the rear, 4 smaller ones at the nose. Unpainted, it had a dull industrial look, stamped aluminum and exposed rivets. Nothing about it suggested elegance. The Raytheon factory in Bedford, Massachusetts turned them out at a rate that peaked around 400 per month during 1968. The AIM-7 Sparrow used semi-active radar homing. The phrase sounds technical. The reality was simple. The Phantom's nose radar illuminated the target with a continuous beam of microwave energy. The missile's seeker head, a small antenna behind a ceramic radome at the front, listened for radar energy bouncing off the target. It didn't carry its own transmitter. It followed reflected light the way a cat follows a flashlight dot on a wall. The Phantom had to keep its radar pointed at the target from launch until impact. Break the lock, and the missile went stupid. The constraint shaped everything about how the weapon fought. "We designed the Sparrow to kill bombers," John Gruning, a propulsion engineer at McDonnell Douglas during the Phantom's development, wrote in his 1997 account of the F-4 program. Nobody at Raytheon or McDonnell was thinking about a 7G MiG at 15,000 feet. The weapon assumed a large cooperative target flying in a straight line. The original requirement came from the Navy's Fleet Defense Mission. Soviet Tu-16 Badger bombers carrying anti-ship missiles would approach a carrier battle group at high altitude, launch from standoff range, and turn for home. The Sparrow needed to reach out 25 nautical miles and destroy something the size of a gymnasium flying level at 35,000 feet. Against that target set, semi-active homing worked beautifully. The bomber held course. The Phantom held course. The reflected energy stayed strong and consistent. Intercept geometry stayed predictable. Vietnam changed the math. MiG-21s weighed 9,000 pounds. They turned at rates that exceeded the Sparrow's seeker gimbal limits. They flew in ground clutter, low altitude, over terrain that bounced radar energy in every direction, flooding the seeker with false returns. The kill probability dropped. Raytheon's own internal estimates put the single-shot probability of kill against a maneuvering fighter at somewhere between 8 and 11% during Rolling Thunder. The Air Force's operational data from 1965 through 1968 confirms roughly that range. Out of 56 Sparrow launches recorded during that period, with sufficient tracking data to evaluate, sources credit between 4 and 6 kills. The records conflict on 2 engagements where battle damage may have come from other sources. 8% sounds terrible. It obscures what the Sparrow actually accomplished. A MiG pilot approaching head-on faced a decision tree with no good branches. If the Phantom launched at maximum range, around 20 nautical miles in ideal conditions, the Sparrow covered that distance in approximately 40 seconds. At typical closure rates, the MiG ate up half the remaining distance during those 40 seconds just by maintaining course. If the first missile missed, the Phantom crew launched a second, then a third. Each one forced the MiG pilot to choose between holding his attack heading and breaking away. Breaking away meant abandoning the intercept. Holding course meant betting his life that the next Sparrow would also miss. The cumulative probability stacked. 3 shots at 8% each gave roughly a 22% chance of dying before you ever reached gun range. 4 shots pushed it past 30%. The vibration hit you first. Your own airframe shuddering from the radar energy, hammering forward, the master arm switch hot under your thumb, the whole aircraft humming with purpose. For the man in the MiG, none of that context existed. He saw nothing until the missile's rocket motor ignited close enough for the smoke trail to register against the sky. By then, geometry had already made his decision for him. The room sat beneath the main hangar at Kubinka Air Base, 40 miles west of Moscow. Concrete walls, fluorescent lighting, no windows. Folding chairs arranged in rows of 6, a chalkboard at the front covered in diagrams that looked like geometry proofs, intersecting arcs, shaded sectors, vectors drawn in colored chalk. Red for threat zones, blue for approach corridors. The blue corridors were narrow. The red zones covered almost everything else. This is where Soviet fighter pilots learned to stay alive against the Phantom. Colonel Viktor Babich ran the tactical instruction program at Kubinka from 1966 through 1971. His curriculum drew on combat reports forwarded from the Soviet advisory mission in Hanoi, filtered through the General Staff's Analysis Directorate, and translated into classroom exercises that MiG-21 pilots repeated until the geometry became instinct. Babich had flown MiG-15s in a Soviet volunteer squadron during the Korean War, a detail the Soviet government denied for decades. He took a 14.7mm round through his canopy rail over the Yalu in 1952 and flew with a scar that ran from his left ear to his jawline. He would die in 1974 when his car struck a fuel truck on the M3 highway outside Tula during a snowstorm. He never flew combat again after Korea. Back to the chalkboard at Kubinka. Babich drew the Phantom's radar coverage as a cone extending forward from the aircraft's nose, 60 degrees wide, roughly 25 nautical miles deep. He shaded the entire cone red. Inside that space, the Sparrow could reach you. Outside it, the Phantom's radar couldn't see you at all. The AN/APQ-1-20 had no rear hemisphere coverage, no side-looking capability. The Phantom's crew had eyeballs and a radar warning receiver for everything behind the 3-9 line. That asymmetry defined the entire tactical problem. The MiG-21 carried the K-13 missile. NATO called it the AA-2 Atoll. It weighed 75 kilograms and tracked infrared radiation. Engine exhaust, essentially. It could only lock onto a heat source it could see, which meant it worked from the rear quarter. Approach from behind, point the seeker at the target's tailpipe. Wait for the growl tone confirming lock. Fire. Maximum engagement range sat around 5 kilometers under good conditions. The seeker had no ability to discriminate a target from the sun, from flares, from hot clouds. It needed a clean look at a jet engine from dead astern. The K-13's origin story tells you something about Soviet missile development in this period. In 1958, a Taiwanese F-86 Sabre fired an AIM-9 Sidewinder at a Chinese MiG-17 over the Taiwan Strait. The missile embedded itself in the MiG's airframe without detonating. The pilot landed with a live American missile lodged in his fuselage. Soviet engineers received the weapon within weeks. Gennady Sokolovsky led the reverse engineering effort at the Vimpel Design Bureau. Within 2 years, they produced the K-13, functionally identical to the early Sidewinder, sharing the same uncooled lead sulfide seeker, the same control fin geometry, the same motor grain. The Soviets never denied this. Vimpel's own institutional history, published in 2004, describes the program matter-of-factly. So Babich stood at his chalkboard with a geometric mismatch that no amount of pilot skill could erase. The Phantom could kill you from 25 nautical miles, head-on. The MiG could kill the Phantom from 5 kilometers, tail-on only. A frontal approach meant flying through the entire depth of the Sparrow's envelope while carrying a missile that couldn't even lock onto the target from that angle. You absorbed all of the risk and carried none of the threat. The Phantom crew knew this. They wanted you to come head-on. They were counting on it. Frontal engagement with radar-guided missile-equipped aircraft is tactically prohibited except under conditions of absolute numerical superiority and coordinated ground control. That sentence appears in a 1969 revision of Soviet Frontal Aviation Tactical Guidelines, referenced in a CIA translation catalogued as FOIA, release number CSI-2001-0037. The language is unambiguous, prohibited, not discouraged, not inadvisable. Soviet doctrine treated the head-on pass against a Sparrow-armed Phantom the way it treated flying into known SAM coverage without electronic countermeasures, as a survivability problem that courage could not solve. Babich drilled the alternative. Come from the side, come from below. Use Ground Control Intercept radar to position the MiG in the Phantom's rear hemisphere before the American crew knew you existed. Get behind him. Let the Atoll see his engines. Fire from 2 kilometers. Then brake hard and run for the deck before his wingman found you. The geometry demanded deception over confrontation. Moscow accepted this. Hanoi's pilots did not always get the message. The Serena 2 radar warning receiver made a sound like a dentist's drill pressed against bone. It sat behind the MiG-21 pilot's headrest, feeding a raw audio tone through the helmet earpieces whenever radar energy painted the aircraft. Continuous tone meant search radar, somebody looking. Pulsing tone meant tracking radar, somebody pointing. The pitch climbed as signal strength increased. At close range, against the Phantom's AN/APQ-1-20 at full power, the sound filled the cockpit so completely that pilots reported losing the ability to hear their own ground controllers. Nguyen Van Coc flew MiG-21s out of Noi Bai airfield. On September 10, 1972, he turned into a pair of Phantoms over Thai Nguyen province at 14,000 feet. His wingman, Nguyen Van Coc, followed him in. Both men had attended tactical briefings based on Babich's curriculum. Both understood the cone. Nguyen broke left at 12 nautical miles. Nai held course. I could see nothing ahead of me except sky. The warning receiver screamed. I thought if I flew fast enough, I would pass through the zone before the missile arrived. I felt the aircraft shudder, not from a hit, from my own speed. The controls grew heavy. Then I saw white smoke rising toward me from below the horizon line, very fast, curving slightly. That account appears in a 1998 Vietnamese language anthology of air combat memoirs compiled by the VPAF historical section. Hai survived. The Sparrow detonated early, a proximity fuse malfunction likely triggered by ground clutter at that altitude. Shrapnel peppered his intake but missed the engine. He landed with 47 holes in the airframe. Nguyen, who broke left, scored a kill that afternoon. He reached the Phantom's rear quarter undetected, locked an Atoll onto the trailing F-4's exhaust, and fired from 1.8 kilometers. The Phantom's crew ejected over the Red River. Nguyen obeyed the geometry. Ni defied it and survived only because Raytheon's fuse malfunctioned. Vietnamese records from 1972 list 9 confirmed head-on engagements attempted by VPAF pilots against Sparrow-armed Phantoms during linebacker operations. Of those 9, 7 ended with the MiG destroyed. 1, Ni's, ended with a damaged aircraft that never flew again. 1 resulted in a mutual abort when both pilots broke off simultaneously. 7 out of 9. The doctrine existed for a reason. Phuong vi hai bai kong. Kuli bon moi, jo kao bon ningan. Bearing 270, range 40 kilometers, altitude 4,000 meters. The voice belonged to a ground controller sitting in a bunker outside Hanoi, watching 2 green blips on a P-35 radar screen converge on a pair of returns tagged as F-4 Phantoms. He spoke in clipped fragments, heading corrections every 15 seconds, range updates every 10. The MiG-21 pilots answered with microphone clicks. 1 click for acknowledged, 2 for unable. They didn't speak because speaking took attention, and attention at this phase of the intercept meant survival. The Soviet-designed Ground Control Intercept system turned the MiG-21 from a short-range point defense fighter into something far more dangerous, a guided weapon with a human warhead. The concept predated Vietnam by a decade. Soviet PVO Strany, the National Air Defense Force, had operated GCI networks against American reconnaissance aircraft along the Soviet periphery since the mid-1950s. The architecture transplanted cleanly to North Vietnam. Soviet advisors installed P-35 and P-37 radar stations in hardened sites around Hanoi, Haiphong, and the major airfields. Vietnamese controllers trained at Krasnodar in southern Russia, learning intercept geometry in Russian before returning home to apply it in Vietnamese. The controller's job reduced to a single objective: place the MiG in the Phantom's rear hemisphere, behind the 3-9 line, outside the AN/APQ-120's detection cone, at a range where the Atoll could acquire the target's exhaust plume. Everything Babich taught at Kubinka depended on this man in the bunker getting the vectors right. Colonel Nguyen Van Coc flew 62 combat sorties between 1967 and 1969. He finished the war credited with 9 aerial victories, the highest-scoring Vietnamese ace. 7 of those kills came from the rear quarter. All 7 used K-13 Atolls. None involved a head-on approach. "The ground controller is your eyes," Coc wrote in a 1978 training manual for VPAF squadron leaders. "You fly where he tells you. You do not search with your own radar. You do not look for the enemy with your eyes until he tells you to look. When he says turn, you turn. When he says climb, you climb. Your discipline is his weapon." The manual, translated in fragments by the Defense Intelligence Agency and partially declassified in 1993, describes the ideal rear-quarter attack in step-by-step detail. The controller vectors the MiG to a point 8 to 10 kilometers behind the target, offset 30 degrees to one side. The pilot descends to place the Phantom's silhouette against the sky above him. Easier to spot visually against blue or white than against terrain. At 6 kilometers, the pilot rolls wings level behind the target and selects the K-13. At 4 kilometers, the seeker should acquire the Phantom's J-79 engine exhaust. The growl comes through the headset, a warbling tone that steadied into a continuous note when the infrared lock solidified. At 2 kilometers, fire. The Phantom crew in this scenario often died without knowing a MiG had been behind them. The F-4's rear visibility bordered on non-existent. The pilot sat forward under a massive windscreen, optimized for the attack role. The radar intercept officer sat behind him, facing instruments. The aircraft's twin vertical stabilizers, broad horizontal tail, and engine nacelles created blind spots that swallowed a MiG-21's slim profile completely. No rearward-looking radar existed on any Phantom variant during Vietnam. The crew depended on their wingmen's eyes and, occasionally, on radar warning receivers that detected the MiG's own radar emissions. Except The MiG's radar stayed off during a GCI-directed approach. The fighter radiated nothing. It absorbed vectors passively through its radio, acquired the target visually, and fired an infrared missile that emitted no radar energy of its own. The entire kill chain operated in silence. On May 10, 1972, the opening day of Linebacker 1, VPAF, controllers directed 8 separate GCI intercepts against American strike packages heading for the Paul Doumer Bridge. 4 resulted in atoll launches from the rear quarter. 2 F-4s went down. Both crews ejected. One was rescued by helicopter from the karst terrain west of Hanoi. The aircrew bruised and dehydrated, but alive. The other crew landed in a village along the Songma River. The records don't say what happened to them for 3 days. Then they appear on a prisoner list forwarded through the Red Cross. Coc's 9 kills cost the Americans 9 aircraft and 18 crewmen. He never once flew into the Sparrow's cone. 9 kills, 0 head-on passes, 0 radar-guided missile engagements. 0 occasions where Coc's aircraft entered the forward hemisphere of an American fighter. The arithmetic sat there in VPAF squadron records for years before American analysts fully grasped what it meant. Not luck or circumstance, but a perfect execution rate on a doctrine designed to neutralize the most dangerous air-to-air weapons system on the planet. Coc flew the same MiG-21PF that every other VPAF pilot flew. Same Atoll missiles with the same copied Sidewinder seeker. Same limited fuel, same narrow radar, the same cramped cockpit where the canopy frame blocked 15 degrees of visibility on each side. Nothing about his equipment distinguished him from the pilots who died attempting frontal passes over Thai Nguyen province. The difference lived entirely in compliance. When Saigon fell in April 1975, American intelligence teams did not reach VPAF facilities in time. South Vietnamese forces secured Noi Bai and Kep airfields in the initial confusion, but the documentation, training manuals, after-action reports, maintenance logs had already moved north or burned. A partial archive surfaced in 1978 when a former VPAF staff officer defected through Thailand carrying microfilm. The DIA's translation section in Arlington spent 14 months working through it. What they found confirmed what Coc's kill record already demonstrated. Every tactical recommendation traced back to Babich's geometry lessons at Kubinka. The language matched the 1969 Frontal Aviation Guidelines almost verbatim in places, translated from Russian to Vietnamese with the doctrinal core preserved intact. Approach from the rear quarter. Maintain radar silence. Trust the ground controller. Fire inside 2 kilometers. Disengage immediately. They had a system, and they ran it, Commander John Nash wrote in a 1979 Naval Fighter Weapons School assessment of VPAF tactics. The engagements, where we lost aircraft, followed an almost identical pattern. No warning, no radar contact, no visual until the missile was already tracking. They killed our guys from behind, and they were disciplined enough to leave before we could respond. That takes training. That takes doctrine somebody believed in. Nash flew F-4s off the USS Constellation during Linebacker 2. His backseater, Lieutenant Ray Alcorn, took shrapnel from an atoll proximity burst on December 19, 1972. The fragment entered below his left shoulder blade. He felt heat before pain, the metal still carrying combustion temperature from the warhead. Alcorn survived. The scar tissue pulled tight across his back for the rest of his life. Coc's system worked because geometry doesn't negotiate. The Sparrow's greatest kill ratio never appeared in any engagement summary. It lived in the fights that never happened. The thousands of intercept opportunities where VPAF controllers watched American strike packages cross their radar screens and ordered their MiGs to hold on the ground. The missile's reputation killed more sorties than its warhead ever killed pilots. Between 1965 and 1973, VPAF records show approximately 4,000 GCI-directed scramble orders issued to MiG-21 units. Roughly half resulted in actual intercepts. Of those, fewer than 300 produced weapons employment. The rest ended in aborted approaches, the geometry unfavorable, the tail aspect solution unobtainable, the phantom formation too tight for a clean rear quarter entry, the warning too late to set up a proper bounce. Every abort represented a pilot who looked at the tactical picture, recognized that reaching the Phantom's 6 o'clock meant first transiting some portion of its forward hemisphere, and chose to go home. The cone that Babich drew on his chalkboard at Kubinka reached across 9,000 miles and 8 time zones to suppress North Vietnamese fighter operations on a daily basis. An American missile engineer in Bedford, Massachusetts, built a weapon so dominant that the enemy's best response involved avoiding combat entirely. Pause on that. The Soviets studied the problem for years after Vietnam. General Lieutenant Anatoly Kornikov, who would later command the entire Russian Air Force, wrote in a 1981 classified assessment that the AIM-7 Sparrow imposed geometric constraints on opposing interceptors that effectively denied the forward hemisphere to aircraft lacking comparable beyond visual range capability. The phrase "denied the forward hemisphere" appears 6 times in the document. Sources conflict on whether Kornikov authored the full report or merely signed it, but the language carried weight. Soviet fighter development programs through the 1980s, the Su-27, the MiG-29, the Vimpel R-27, all prioritized one objective above every other: closing the BVR gap that the Sparrow had opened. They spent 15 years and billions of rubles building missiles that could do what the AIM-7 already did. By the time the R-27 entered operational service in 1986, the Americans had moved on to the AIM-120 AMRAAM. Active radar guidance, fire and forget, no need to hold a lock. The gap didn't close. It widened. Coc's 9 kills proved the doctrine worked. They also proved something Babich never wrote on his chalkboard: that the best a MiG-21 pilot could hope for, flying against America's frontline fighter, involved sneaking up behind it and running away. The highest scoring ace in the VPAF achieved everything through avoidance of the Phantom's primary weapon system. His entire career validated American technological superiority by the method he chose to survive it. The MiG that fell over Hanoi in Section 1, the aircraft that came apart while its pilot flew straight into an F-4's forward quarter, joined a statistical category the Air Force tracked with bureaucratic precision. 7th Air Force's Intelligence Division maintained a database at Tan Son Nhut, cataloging every confirmed MiG kill by weapon type, engagement geometry, altitude band, and time of day. Each entry carried a sequential reference number, a date-time group, and the names of the American crew. The database migrated to microfilm in 1974, then to the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, where it sits today under file group K717.3042. The after-action report for that engagement listed it as a head-on aim. 7 kill at 14,000 feet. Forward quarter intercept. Single missile expended. Single MiG-21 destroyed. Elapsed time from radar contact to impact, 28 seconds.